Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Welcome back again. Welcome back again, and welcome back again. I don't know what the name of the next thing that's coming after us is, but I know what I'm personally going to call it. Anyway, so nice to be back together again, even if it does mean we all have to wear pants. I thought that would get a bigger laugh. Tonight, as you all know, I scrapped Mel Brooks. Hopefully we'll be able to hit that at some point, but we do have a lot planned in the coming weeks. Next week, we are observing Hayes's Refugee Shabbat, which is an annual occasion where we talk about refugee and immigrant issues. And Karima Majidi will be with us. She's an Afghan refugee from years ago who is now assisting with resettlement of people. And Steve Tabachman, who is a member of our congregation, but just moved to San Francisco, will be visiting. Yeah, I know, it was a bummer. Will be visiting here, and he's going to talk for 15, 20 minutes about the economic impact of immigrants, which is something that we don't think about very much, but especially at a time when we have low birth rates in this country, we need to bring in talented and, desiring people to come here. The following week, we will not have services because Saturday night we're celebrating Purim. And this year it is also our big fundraiser. So we're gonna have, from what I understand, outstanding food and home intuition. We're going to see the world in-person premiere, because it was online already, of Shushan Files, because I could not get it together with anybody to do a Perm spiel this year, so we're going to do the one last year, but on the big screen. I mean, how immersive will that be? If you haven't seen it, that's the Perm spiel I did for the pandemic. And then we will be joined by the real drag queens of Bingo for a fun evening there. It is, obviously, if you're thinking about bringing your young children, please don't. But the next morning on Sunday, we'll have a great program in the Spinoza program for them. And then on March 25th, I don't remember, I think it might be Fran Jor speaking about his new book, Soupy Sales and the Detroit Experience. So we've got, and then the following week, The Constitution of Truth by Johnson Rausch. I'll be talking about that book, and you're welcome to read it. There's a whole explanation of it in the book club section of the newsletter. All right, so let's get started. Our ancestors hallowed the Sabbath day. In dark times, it was a refuge for them, and in times of prosperity, it gave them rest and joy. As a community, we celebrate the opportunity to gather in that spirit, even as we imagine Shabbat anew. May we too find rest from the week's activities. May we too feel the warmth of love and companionship. May we always feel our joys heightened and our sorrows softened by the love we give and receive. Together, may we be blessed with Shabbat joy. May we be blessed with Shabbat peace. May we be blessed with Shabbat light. And I'd like to invite Jean Claridge and Audrey Pleasant to light our Shabbat candles.
Baruch haor ba'olam, Baruch haor ba'adam, Baruch haor ba'shalom, ba'shalom, Baruch haor, Baruch haor,
Our readers tonight are Helen Foreman, Susie Friedman, Saul Foreman, Melanie Goldberg, and Rabbi Miriam Jairus. And we will continue with reading number 3. And Helen.
We come together this Shabbat each bringing with us a private world of hopes, of fears, of dreams. Some of us are burdened by anxieties and cares that all but crash our hope in the future. Others have hearts filled with happiness, grateful for the joys of the past week, yet aware that even the most fortunate are vulnerable before the mystery of tomorrow. Every life is a unique blending of joy and sorrow, of fulfillment and frustration. Beneath our uniqueness, we are all bound together by our common humanity. All of us deeply yearn to know true freedom and peace. Each of us seeks the personal liberation of a mind that is not enslaved to conventional wisdom. Each of us strives, too, for the inner peace that comes with finding a harmony between our aspirations and our abilities. This is the Shabbat peace to which we aspire.
There are times when we seek things for ourselves and measure failure by what we do not gain. When we gather on Shabbat, we seek not to acquire, but to share. There are times when we exploit nature as if it were a horn of plenty that can never be exhausted. When we gather on Shabbat, we emphasize our true place on this earth. There are times when we act as if we cared nothing for the right of others. When we gather on Shabbat, we remind ourselves that justice is our duty and a better world our goal. Let us embrace this moment, a Shabbat gathering to unite, to learn, and to better ourselves.
Shalom
Shabbat Shalom. At one with our forebearers, we affirm that righteousness and enlightenment shall be our torch. We shall teach these values diligently to our children all the days of our lives. We shall endeavor to live by these values in the comfort of our homes or on cold and windswept roads. Whether adversity bows our heads or fulfillment makes our spirits soar, our hands shall mete out justice to all, and our eyes shall be open to the light of truth. We shall emblazon our paths through life with this light as a beacon for all humankind.
When justice burns within us like a flaming fire, when love evokes willing sacrifice from us, when, to the last full measure of selfless devotion, we demonstrate our belief in the ultimate triumph of truth and righteousness, then goodness encompasses our lives and we can begin to change the world.
Isaiah prophesied, "They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore." The poet Yehuda Amichai wrote, "Don't stop after beating the swords into plowshares. Don't stop. Go on beating and make musical instruments out of them. Whoever wants to make war again will have to turn them into plowshares first."
Shalom, shalom,
this community where we find strength and common purpose, we turn our minds and hearts toward all those who need our love and support, those who are ill, those who suffer pain of the body or spirit, those who are lonely, and those who have been wronged. Tonight, we extend our well wishes to these members of our congregation and their loved ones, to Joe Gaden and Rabbi Peter Schweitzer. And if you've noticed that Sybil Offen's name is not on the list, that's because she went home today. If there's someone whom you're thinking about and you want to share, we'll just start over here. Anybody on this side? No, anybody over here? Miriam? Anybody else? May all who suffer know that they are not alone. May they be healed quickly. May they experience a refuah shlema, a complete recovery, the renewal of their bodies and the renewal of their spirits.
If I should die and leave you here a while, be not like others sore undone, who keep long vigil by the silent dust. For my sake, turn again to life and smile, nerving thy heart and trembling hand to do something to comfort other hearts than mine. Complete these dear unfinished tasks of mine, and I perchance may therein comfort you.
Our thoughts turn to those who are no longer with us, our own loved ones, those whom our friends and neighbors have lost, the martyrs of our people whose graves are unmarked, and those of every people and nation whose lives have been a blessing to humanity. As we remember them, we meditate on the meaning of love and loss, of life and death. We recall now our loved ones whom death has recently taken from us, those who died at this season in years past, and those whom we have taken into our hearts with our own. Tonight, we observe the yahrzeits of Albert Asher, Herman Becker, Michael Berman, Annette Borovitz, Barbara Cohen Mellon, Jenny Fenton, Samuel Foreman, Esther Jacoby, Ann Jarris, Rebecca Kravitz, Stanley Leibowitz, Louis Linden, Barbara Lipschutz, Greta Lipson, Max Luria, A. David Markowitz, Eli Master, Pauline Robb, Marion Sandler, Herman Schneider, Gertrude Stewart, Reva Thatch, Ariane Abraham Walker, and Abraham Young. If there's someone whom you're thinking of who's no longer with us, Jean.
Lemby Allen, who died yesterday at the age of 104. She was a very good friend.
Zichra Livracha, Miriam. Thank you. Anyone else, Andy? So sorry. Did we miss anybody?
We can't forget Avery Cole.
Say it again?
Judge Avery Cole.
Oh, yes, yes, who died a couple weeks ago. Yehi zichron livracha, may the memories of these people bring us some measure of comfort as we face life in their absence. And if you can do so comfortably, please rise as we recite our humanistic interpretation of Kaddish. together. Nit Gadal v'nit Kadash beruach Hadam. Let us dignify and ennoble all people in the spirit of our shared humanity. Let us acclaim the preciousness of life. Let us show gratitude for life by approaching it with reverence. Let us embrace the whole world, even as we wrestle with its parts. Let us each in our own way take up our share in serving the world and seeking truth. May our commitment to life help us to strengthen healing of the spirit and peace of mind. May justice and peace permeate and comfort the house of Israel and all who dwell on earth. And let us say, Ken Yehi, may it be so. Please be seated. So when I talked to a few people this morning, including some of you, about whether we should continue with our regularly planned topic or not, the sentiment seemed to go in the direction of let's talk about Ukraine. The problem with that, of course, is I don't know a lot about Ukraine. I know probably as much as some of you do. I know a lot about the Jewish history there. And the Jewish history there is very rich. So I'm going to start with that a little bit, tell you about the country, the Jewish history of it. Because the Jewish history does reflect a lot of the issues that are going on. You know, we're always a little bit of a mirror up to the societies in which we live, particularly back in the day. And then I've got 3 short videos, well, 2 really short ones, and then one that's a little bit longer. One that lays out the geography for us, one that talks a little bit about what's happened the last few days. That's a very short one, just the latest thing that came out of CBS News with some pictures. And then one that's by The Economist that has a much more, it's a video that they prepared, a much more in-depth look at some of the confrontational issues that have gone on and how this was generated. Just to remind you a little bit, Jews were there a really long time, right? It's been part of our history. It's sort of the southern area that we come from. Now, there's evidence of Jewish settlement going back probably as early as, well, it could have been as early as the 4th or 5th century CE, but we're not entirely sure about that. And in any case, the communities from which our ancestors came probably began arriving there sometime around possibly the 9th, 10th, 11th century into the 14th, 15th century. By the 16th century, you had a very large community of Jews there. It's very hard to date these things, and Jewish migration across Europe is still something that is heavily debated. Most scholars, however, believe that we arrived in Europe, at least the seeds of population of Jews who left Europe in the 19th and 20th century for these shores, that we arrived there sometime around the 4th, 5th century in the Western area, with Roman traders and so forth. That's the best guess. That settlement took place primarily in Central Europe. The evidence of Yiddish is a very good place to start, because Yiddish, of course, is a Germanic language, but it also has an enormous number of Slavic elements and so forth. But the area that we settled into was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. That's what it became. And Ukraine was part of that. Not all of Ukraine. And, well, I'm not going to put up, I thought maybe I'd put up 1,000 apps for you. I'm not going to put up 1,000 apps. I'll show you a couple at the end. But that area there, going from north up in Lithuania and Poland and over what became, well, what was Prussia and so forth, and Western Russia, all the way down through the middle, all the way down to the bottom, that was where the Jews were. And as you know, that after the tripartite annexations of what was the Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth when it fell apart, Russia took a big, giant chunk of it, and that included the eastern part of Ukraine. Prussia took a very large chunk of the northwestern side of it, and then down to the middle. And I'm probably showing you how it looked on my map, so I apologize. And then the Austro-Hungarian Habsburgs took on the rest. and that included Hungary and parts of what became Czechoslovakia and so forth. And that's where our families all came from. But this was right in the middle.
After World War I or?
No, this is going way back to the 14th century. Way back to the 14th century. Now, the area is, and always has been, divided religiously. It didn't become a very Christian area until right about that time, the 9th and 10th century. There was a major conversion. And I'm not going to go into all the history of how the Byzantine Roman Empire spread this way and the Italian Roman Empire went that way. Hopefully you know a little bit about world history, and you know that two big churches formed, and Ukraine was kind of in the middle. And to this day, that has an effect on them. The Eastern Orthodox Church became the dominant church in the southwest the southeast and the eastern areas. And the further west you went, the more Catholic it was. So these are not cleanly divided lines, and I can show you where they moved around on maps, but that's more or less what happened. That's why we have the Eastern Orthodox in the east, and we have the Catholic Church in the west. The parts of the places that Jews lived as we move closer to modern times would probably be mostly Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Russia, Poland, and today's Ukraine, but not all of it. And the Jews, when we first went there, were pretty welcomed. This was a wide open area. You'll see that that plays into the conflict today as well, because geography is destiny to a certain extent, and a great deal of Ukraine is very rich agricultural land. And it was very rich and it was very unsettled. Now keep in mind this was the southern part, but this was true going all the way up through the north. These were flatlands with great areas to navigate agriculturally and business-wise, lots of trading routes. And around the time of again, we'll say the 12th, 13th century, we had a system in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth of very wealthy landowners. It was a unique place because it was actually kind of a democracy if you were part of the very elite, which is why the Hasidic Jews later would mimic their dress. That was Polish-Lithuanian elite dress. And that went all the way down into the heartland of today's Ukraine. The Jews were welcomed there because these rich landowners also needed middlemen to run the properties. They called this system the Arrenda system. And the Arrenda system was incredibly cruel to the peasants. And the Jews were in the middle. And it was actually for a very long time a good place to be a Jew for hundreds and hundreds of years. I think you've done a course on this period of time, right? You're doing it now, okay. So you're learning about the Council of the Four Lands and the sort of semi-Jewish autonomy that was in effect then. It was a good place for several hundred years to be Jewish. And remember that they had left Western Europe, which was a terrible place to be Jewish. I talked about England. The English Jews were the lucky ones because they got thrown out, the ones that weren't burned in York. But they got thrown out, but it took a long time for the worst of it to really bubble over to where the Jews had no choice but to leave. And where did they go? They went to the east. In the 17th century, things began to sort of disintegrate for the Jewish communities. There were a number of reasons for this. A big part of it was the fact that other empires were growing very large around them, but there was also a large pushback against this Arrenda system. And one of the places where this was the most intense was in Ukraine, where a lot of men particularly had essentially escaped the system and formed groups of what we today call Cossacks. And there was a Kozak Rebellion in the 1640s, the late 1640s into the 50s, led by a name that has gone down in infamy in Jewish history, Bogdan Khmelnytsky, which I'm sure if you haven't covered, you will be covering soon. Okay, which was resulted in mass uprisings everywhere. but enormous, enormous suffering for the Jews down in that area. There were probably around 700 Jewish communities that were affected in one way or another, some of these being very small, Städtlach, as we imagine them, and those were not Fiddler on the Roof Städtlach. Those were horrible, poverty-stricken areas because things were getting worse economically at the time for Jews, but also cities where Jews lived and where wealthier Jews were. The death estimates are very, very difficult to come by. 100,000 is the smallest I've heard, and I've heard much, much higher than that among Jews. This was also a time when the three big powers, the Habsburgs, the Russian Empire, and Prussia, began to become very agitated amongst each other and looked into how they could steal as much land as they possibly could. And within 100 years, well, about 120 years of this time, we had the complete dissolution of Poland and Lithuania in favor of these three countries that I talked about. The luckier ones were generally in the south, particularly the Austro-Hungarian Empire. My family came from Hungary. That was considered luckier. The further north you went, Prussia was considered somewhat luckier. But Russia, which actually wound up with the vast majority of the Jews, that wasn't so lucky. And by the late 18th century, the Russian Empire had established what we all now know as the Pale of Settlement. And it was quite horrible. This fissure going down the middle, which I don't know if the videos I selected really do a good job of telling this, but this fissure is roughly defined by the Dnieper River, if you're looking in the south. And the fissure really led to sort of a, well, it didn't lead to this, but it reflected sort of eastern-looking part of, I keep doing east on my map, an eastern-looking part of Ukraine and those areas, because there was no Ukraine as a country. That's a relatively new phenomenon. And the more western-facing places. After World War II, well, let's say up until World War II, Russia didn't have all the property down there, but as you know, after World War II, lots of property was added, and Ukraine got a lot of that. So these were even more western-facing. That's your western-facing people that came in, who were part of, on the other side even of the Carpathian Mountains, or were as much Austrian as anything else. Now, of course, that doesn't reflect today's demography, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but it's a varied area. And so there are absolutely people, the further east you go, who view themselves as Russians. The Russian language and the Ukrainian language are very closely related, maybe a little bit like Italian, and I've heard Italian and Spanish, so not terribly mutually intelligible, but every language, what's a dialect and what's a language? That's a big controversy among linguists. Usually boils down to who has an army and who doesn't. So a dialect is a language is a dialect with its own army. But there's also been standardization and a revival of Ukrainian culture that's been going on since the 19th century and really began to flower before the First World War, and then was kind of crushed as all the ethnic identities there were crushed by the Soviet Union. When the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed between Hitler and the Soviet Union, it was the move into more Jewish areas, which tended to be, to a certain extent, a little bit west of the Dnieper, that the Soviets moved into. And then, of course, after Operation Barbarossa, when Hitler sort of stabbed Stalin in the back and betrayed the agreement that they had, that was inevitable. The Nazis moved in, and that was the end of that for Soviet Jews who lived in what had been the Pale of Settlement from north to south. And we know that Poland, of course, what was Poland pre-war, the between the war Polands, because that's when Poland reemerged, was after the First World War. The between the war Polands had the bulk of Jews in Europe, but this blended into it. And there were 1.5 million Jews that were killed among the Ukrainian Jewish population. And again, these borders moved. Was my former father-in-law of blessed memory, was he a Polish Jew? Well, he thought he was a Polish Jew, but he lived in today's Belarus, and not too far from Vilnius, which, you know, was considered Poland. It was the Jerusalem of Europe, it was called at one point. So the Jewish story does, to a certain extent, reflect the reality of the entire area. And it's always been a contentious area because it really is on the line between the East and the West, and we're seeing that today. You probably remember the Cold War stuff better than I do. I was a kid, and you know, I brush up on it and I remember it. But the Cold War was really a moment of complete Soviet domination, complete Russian domination of that entire area, and the consequences are laying before us today. So that's just a little reminder. And again, if you want more in depth, you've got Natan's classes and all kinds of books that you could look into. I hope I didn't make any glaring mistakes. The last time I taught Eastern European Jewry was a long time ago, so I had to go back and write a lot of things down, mostly from memory today. The current Ukraine, which includes all kinds of, I do have a little map at the end of these videos to show you, and we'll stop after each video to see if you want to have some discussion. You can either talk really loud, like Tom does, or you can come over here, to this microphone, or we can move the microphone, whatever. I'll leave you in charge of the microphone. Today, everybody's seen the map. You all know what the map looks like very, very well. The country's about the size of France, give or take. There's about 41, 42 million people there. I mentioned the multicultural nature of it. About 77, 78% of Ukraine's current population identify as ethnic Ukrainians. The second largest nationality, bulked up in the east, and this is including, I believe, Crimea, which is not really part of Ukraine anymore, because as you know, the Russians took it. Was it 2008, I believe? 2014. They took it, but they're about 17, 18% of the population. But there are significant numbers of others. There's Romanians, which of course is just one hop and a skip over from Moldova, which was one of the Soviet republics that is it's the only one on the west side. This is otherwise the border of the Soviet Union, and its influenced republics only went that far. The Crimean Tatars, who have gone and come back actually, and are very Russian-oriented. Bulgarians, Hungarians, that's that western area. Poles, that would be more towards the north. Jews, of course, and Armenians. It is a large Jewish community, relatively speaking. We don't know all the exact numbers. After the fall of the Soviet Union, many Jews left, what we call now the FSU, the former Soviet Union. But there are, by at least most of the figures I look at, maybe as many as 200,000, with a little plus sign perhaps, Jews left there, but not clear how many of them identify as Jews. The entire Jewish community, like most of the former Soviet Union, is dominated by Chabadniks, which is a little strange, I know, but they're the ones who went in all over Russia and all over the former Soviet Union afterwards. I will say this, though, that in Ukraine, they probably have the most legitimate claim, because Ukraine, in that southern area, was the capital of Hasidism. One of the reactions, and I know you've taught this, one of the reactions to the Khmelnytsky massacre was the rise of a very spiritual, very inward-looking kind of Judaism, a very Kabbalistic kind of Judaism, and that was the origin of the European Hasidim that we're so familiar with, founded by Baal Shem Tov. So they have some legitimacy being there, although most of them came from Brooklyn before they went back, before they went into the former Soviet Union. They had long been here. And the north, of course, there were plenty of Hasidim up there too, but the Litvak became a synonym for opponent of Hasidism, and it still is today. Maybe sometime I'll revisit my lecture on a Friday night about the understanding the Orthodox Jewish world better. Haven't done that for a while. There's been some changes even since I gave it. All right, so I think we're going to, I don't know, I probably don't need to turn off the lights.
Ukraine is the quintessential borderland state.
Okay.
The country borders 3 former Soviet states, Russia, Belarus, and Moldova, and 4 countries in the European Union: Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania. Ukraine also has a coastline along the Black Sea to the south. Ukraine sits on the northern European plain, the area that has historically served as an invasion superhighway going east and west. Beyond its strategic location, Ukraine's geography has only facilitated such invasions. The country consists of flat and fertile plains, with the exception of a Carpathian mountain range that arches into the far west of the country. But even these mountains can be penetrated and have not posed a significant barrier to invasion. Given such lack of barriers, Ukraine's wide open geography is inextricably linked to that of Russia. Ukraine's agricultural and industrial belts have traditionally been integrated with Russia's, and Ukraine serves as the primary transit state for Russian energy exports to Europe. Due to its location and abundance of agricultural and mineral resources, Ukraine has been contested between regional powers for centuries. This competition is currently playing out in an extreme form today, with a Western-backed government confronting a Russian-backed uprising in eastern Ukraine. Further complicating the situation is the fact that Ukraine has several population and political cores, including Lvov in the west, Kiev in the center, and the eastern cities of Donetsk and Luhansk. These different cores make administering Ukraine difficult. The current crisis in Ukraine is therefore merely the latest iteration of the country's internal divisions and long-standing East-West conflict over the country. Maintaining sovereignty and unity in the face of this competition is Ukraine's primary geographic challenge.
All right, so that was just, I thought, a good video. I scoured the internet for videos that had good maps. But I think it gives, first of all, you could see the Dnieper River very easily, the S-shaped curve in it, and it really does indicate a cultural shift too. Not to say that there aren't people on both sides, but that's sort of where it begins to blend more into the west, go this way, more into the west, and of course the eastern provinces being much more Russian in identity. But understand too that the Russians themselves view Russia as having been born in this area as well. And that's important to understand. That doesn't mean that all Russians are supporting this invasion. In fact, I think we've seen on our televisions a great deal of opposition because there are new geopolitical realities since the fall of the Soviet Union. Even in that those 2 eastern enclaves there, where they held where they voted after 1991 on independence for Ukraine, they went in enormous numbers for Ukraine. I think it was upwards of 90%. So it's important to keep that in mind. I'm not saying they feel that way now, a lot's changed. But today this is as much a cultural battle between the West and the East as it's ever been. And in some ways more so, because over here in the United States, it cannot have escaped your attention that there are elements on the right in particular, but not only, but certainly elements on the right that praise Putin up one side and down the other. They are playing nonstop on Russian television loops of Pompeo and Trump and Tucker Carlson and others. There are people who view what Putin has built there as being a Christian nationalist paradise. Understand that homosexuality there is absolutely under the table. Okay, it is not open like it is in the West. That non-Christian religions and non-Christian people and atheists are highly alienated from society. That there is book banning and book burning all over the place that would delight the most Trumpian of Trumpists. And so they view Putin as being very heroic. And yeah, and you've seen what's happening. To watch them, you know, I'm on Twitter, to watch them do this two-step about whether they really believe in democracy or not, it's very clear that increasingly democracy is not the value that they hold dearest. It's their Christianity and their primarily white Christian identity. And that holds true in Ukraine. We know what's happening in Hungary, albeit it's further to the west. I think there's going to be much more pushback there very soon. But that's part of the frustration that we are experiencing. The Western world, we're not up against, these, whatever they were, perhaps cynically, but nonetheless idealistic Soviets who had this theory of how humanity should be, that they were going to shove down the world's throats. We're dealing now really with the classical 20th century problem of autocracy versus freedom. And it's playing out in the United States, and it's playing out in Europe, and the dividing line for the world right now is Russia, China to a very great extent, but that's a whole different story in terms of our cultural battles, and everything to the west of it, with our devotion to democracy and the fact that within their world they have plenty of people who are Democrats, I mean small d Democrats, and on our side we have plenty of people who are autocrats, down to the point where it's not unusual to open up Twitter now and see people who are prominent Republicans questioning whether democracy is really a value that America believes in. There's a lot of that going on. I'll do another, that I know something about, and I'll do a lecture on that another time. So I don't know if I really want to play this one, but I might as well. These are fresh pictures. It's only a minute and a half, and it'll make it easier on Arthur. But I'll read it to you because there's no narration. So Ukraine's forces have been locked in a nearly 8-year conflict with Russia-backed separatists, leaving 14,000 people dead. Began in 2014 when former Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych was removed by mass protests. He was the one friendly to Russia. Russia responded by annexing the Crimean Peninsula and backing this insurgency in Donetsk and Luhansk. And those were the areas that we saw. I don't know who drew that. They don't really march like that. They're giants. Within a few months, Russian-backed rebels seized the control of this area. This is the Donbass region, and there is a peace treaty that was drawn up in 2015. Moscow didn't accept this, but it did use the region to keep Ukraine in its sphere, including preventing it from joining NATO. I don't know how clear it was they were ever going to join NATO. This peace treaty that was drawn up in Belarus really hasn't done very much. That's what this is a reference to. Russia, Ukraine, and some EU countries signed it, but it was very vague, and it did result in a pullback of some of the heavy weaponry and the full-scale fighting, but it didn't really solve any of the problems. And these are pictures from that particular clash, and some of these are just from the last few days too, as we've seen the last since the invasion. What was it? Today's the 24th. It was on the 22nd. The first thing he did this past Monday was to recognize Donetsk and Luhansk as independent countries. That killed the 2015 peace agreement, and that's how we got where we are now. And then I think we'll go ahead and play this. This is a good piece. This one's a little bit longer, about 8 or 9 minutes, by The Economist.
The world's attention is on the border between Russia and Ukraine, the site of the biggest military buildup in Europe since the Cold War. Russia has already annexed Crimea, part of Ukrainian territory, and plunged Donbass in Ukraine's southeast into a separate conflict.
Our allies and partners ready to impose severe cost and significant harm on Russia and the Russian economy.
If Russia changes borders again by force, this will be a challenge to whole of European security.
But how did Ukraine become a flashpoint between Russia and the West? And why won't Russia leave Ukraine alone?
I don't think that Putin's finished with Ukraine. I don't think he will leave Ukraine unmolested.
This was a few days before the invasion.
Vladimir Putin disputes whether a border between Russia and Ukraine should exist.
Не просто близкие соседи. Мы фактически, как я уже много раз говорил, один народ.
He says that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, and has claimed Ukraine isn't a state, but Ukraine is proud of its independence.
Ми молода країна з тисячолітньою історією.
Russia and Ukraine do have a shared ancestry. The union between Moscow and Kiev in the 17th century formed the base of the Russian Empire. Moscow considers Kiev the cradle of its civilization and its faith. Over the centuries since, the two countries have been intimately connected. Ukraine was a cornerstone of the Soviet Union until the bloc collapsed in 1991. At the time, Ukrainian independence went hand in hand with a new democratic Russia.
Ukraine, in many ways, set the example for Russia's own independence from the Soviet Union and the idea of Russia as a democratic republic.
But over the years, Moscow came to view Ukraine's independence as a strategic blow, as well as an emotional one. Today, around 13% of Ukrainians are ethnically Russian, and nearly a third speak Russian as a first language. But despite these ties, recent events are turning many Ukrainians against Russia.
It's a country which is responsible for 14,000 dead soldiers and civilians in the war in the east of Ukraine. It's a country that grabbed part of their territory. It's the country that poses constant threat.
75% of Ukrainians born since 1991 now see their future as in the EU, rather than with Russia. But a democratic Ukraine with ties to the West is unacceptable to Russia, mainly due to Ukraine's strategic significance. Ukraine is caught between two spheres of influence, the West and its defensive alliance NATO on one side, and Russia on the other. Vladimir Putin is determined to keep Ukraine in Russia's orbit and keep it out of alliances with others.
Putin doesn't want Ukraine to join NATO because he now sees it as antagonistic towards Russia. A fellow Slavic country, as he says, the same people as us, as a member of NATO, as part of the West, is an affront.
In 1991, NATO borders in Central Europe only ran as far east as Germany. But as former Soviet bloc countries joined, NATO alliance in Central Europe now runs in some places right up to the Russian border. Ukraine itself separates Russia from 4 NATO members. As far as Russia is concerned, Ukraine must never join NATO. And for Ukraine's first years of independence, that didn't seem likely. Ukraine was led by governments friendly to Moscow. But by Ukraine's 2004 presidential elections, it was clear Ukrainians had begun to look westwards, and Russia's influence had its limits. With the help of mass protests, Putin-backed candidate Viktor Yanukovych lost to pro-Western Viktor Yushchenko. It became known as the Orange Revolution, and was evidence that Russia was losing control of Ukraine.
Orange Revolution, it mattered because people rose against somebody he backed. It showed that people have agency.
Even when Yanukovych was voted in 5 years later, Putin still couldn't get his own way in Ukraine. Yanukovych continued to look both ways, to Europe and to Russia. When Ukraine was offered an association agreement with the EU, Putin countered with an economic offer of his own. Yanukovych eventually ditched the EU deal in favor of the economic pact with Russia. But many Ukrainians felt sold out, and peaceful protests in Kiev followed. Yanukovych's response was brutal, sparking further demonstrations and the downfall of his government. It was a slap in the face for Putin.
Video has emerged which appears to show President Yanukovych's entourage fleeing from his luxurious mansion outside Kiev.
Putin was furious. He was coming after similar protests in Russia. He had to make an example of Ukraine. He had to show that such events, revolutions, end badly and they end in civil war.
Putin's response was to annex the Ukrainian territory of Crimea.
Crimea, of course, means a lot to Russians. It has enormous symbolic importance. Of all the territories lost by Russia during the disintegration of the Soviet Union, the loss of Crimea was felt most acutely. His popularity rating shot up.
Putin went on to encourage uprisings of pro-Russian separatists in the east of Ukraine, a conflict that's still going on. Putin's strategy has ensured that the EU and NATO keep Ukraine at arm's length, and stirring up conflict on Russia's borders could help with troubles at home. Putin's popularity is falling. Opposition to his regime is increasing, particularly among the young. In 2021, street protests erupted after opposition leader Alexei Navalny was poisoned and then thrown in jail.
Putin needs a new source of legitimacy, and conflict with the West provides, in his eyes, that source of legitimacy.
Putin portrays himself as Russia's defender against a failing West. Western-style democracy can't be allowed to contrast favorably against his rule, least of all in neighboring Ukraine. A successful democracy next door might lead people to demand the same thing at home.
He's trying to protect his regime and compensate for insecurity and weakness internally by external aggression. And that's what rulers who exploited their people, who've run corrupt and militaristic regimes have done over decades and centuries. Putin is definitely not the first leader to do that, and in that sense he's fallen into that old trap.
For as long as Putin's political woes continue, Russia's border with Ukraine is unlikely to be left in peace.
Thank you for watching, and if you want to read more of our coverage on Russia and Ukraine, please click on the link below, and don't forget to subscribe.
Well, you can't click on any links, but anyway, I thought that those were two good explainers of what was going on. My take on this is that with the absence of communism, socialism, at least authoritarian socialism, which essentially is gone in the world, what we have set up, at least across the northern hemispheres, is autocracy and increasing religiosity versus secularism and democracy and more openness. And both societies have minorities within them that threaten the larger point of view. In the United States, it's really clear. The young people are, by and large, just as they are in Ukraine. It's not that they're overflowing either in Ukraine or here with American patriotism, although you do hear that. But they're overflowing with the idea of real freedom. Not phony baloney, you know, give me my liberty and no vaccine. I mean real liberty, where you get to talk about what history really was about and what was done to people and how we want to be better people and treat people with dignity and listen to as many voices as we can. And we've seen in the United States how we're struggling with that here. It's both an ethnic and religious battle, but it's also an ideological battle. It's much more like the kind of democracy and the kind of point of view that united the Western world against Hitler. But now the Hitlerian kind of philosophy has moved further east. It was always there. There was never a great deal of difference between Stalin and Hitler. But Stalin was operating under this, whether he believed it or not, this fantasy of the workers of the world uniting and communism and so forth, as I understand it. And with the disappearance of that, it's not even about economic systems anymore. The world is capitalist, and that's just how it is, you know, with various degrees of governmental assistance that is called democratic socialism or what have you. It's really about whether or not we're going to trust people to live their own lives the way that they want to live and what the balance is between personal responsibility and collective responsibility. And I think that's a very human problem. And then you get strong men like Trump, who fortunately is not smart enough to be a real strong man and was dealing with a system that still has a lot of protection. We'll see what happens when a smarter guy like DeSantis or, well, I was going to say Abbott, but this, you know, the governor of Florida is not a stupid man. And if you see what he's doing there, his gradual banning of books and favoring of religious points of view. So anyway, that's sort of my take on the very large picture. When I have to confront something, I know Sherwin knew everything about everything in the world. I don't. So I have to go watch 75 videos and reread a textbook from 1987 about Eastern Europe. So I can facilitate a conversation. My opinions are as valid as anyone else here. I don't have any magic answers. I just wanted to recognize that we're congregated here and we can have a discussion now for a little while. Tom, go ahead. You're itching to go.
What is your definition of an autocracy?
A place where there's a strong single ideology that's in charge, that doesn't listen to others, that decides what the culture of a place is going to be unilaterally. What is it? It's Putin in Russia. That's what an autocracy is. It's generally a dictatorship, but it's not necessarily, look, even in Russia, he has to listen to a certain amount of public opinion, but there's a narrowness to what's allowed. So for instance, they haven't made being gay illegal, they've made it underground and horrible. By the way, people forget, even Hitler had to listen to public opinion. I know people don't think about this, but I want to give a very good example. When Hitler, long before there was a final solution in place, there was plenty of persecution of the Jews, Nuremberg laws and everything else. There was also an entire plan of eugenics to get rid of people who were developmentally disabled. And this was at a time, of course, when even in the United States, we put our developmentally disabled people in homes and tried to pretend that they didn't exist. But Hitler's plan was that he wanted to see, could we just really get rid of them? That's what he wanted to do. The first experiments with Zyklon B, which is the gas that was used ultimately in the death camps many years later, were in vans where they would pile in developmentally disabled people, and they would drive around in these vans, and they would kill the people through the gas in the vans. People got hold of this. They got wind of this. The German people heard about it, and they didn't like it, and they got really angry. And this, despite the fact that they did not have a free press in which to comment on it, or any kind of free press, or access to the radio waves or whatever, there was still a bubbling up of outrage about it. And Hitler responded. He stopped this policy. He could not afford to continue something that had people gotten word of that was so popular. But we're talking about the control of the press as well. We're talking about, and in today's society, you don't have to control the press through a monopoly. We've talked about this before. Because of the chaotic means by which we receive our news now, misinformation and flooding the plane with it is just as effective in many ways as monopolistic information holding, which is what they had in Germany and what they had in the Soviet Union. So you can actually, and yet in autocratic societies, they still try to shut down the major organs that don't agree with them. And this is why we've seen in Hungary and in Russia, television stations and radio stations being shut down regularly. And just to let you know, it doesn't always have to be government. It can be also people just simply controlling the means. Just look at what happened to our own beloved John Arking and the dissolution of his career there in Howell due to purchase of this station that he worked at by people who didn't want to hear about trans kids or drag queens reading children's books at melon festivals or whatever else it was that he was being accused of presenting in an unbalanced way. So there are other ways to do it too. You can do it simply through monopolizing. So that's a piece of it too. And autocracy is, by the way, it's the way that most societies have been run throughout history. We switched over from dynastic kinds of autocracies, and in those days they didn't have any press, much less a free press, and so it's become more sophisticated. But most of human history has been a big, powerful group of leaders running the show and putting people in their place. And it's much more complicated today, but it's also can be distilled, in my opinion, down to that. I don't think, I have young people, we argue about, communism, capitalism, socialism, whatever. I'm not an economist, and I grew up in a capitalist society. I'm a capitalist. Do I want better medicine, better medical care? Yeah, socialized medicine, that kind of thing? Sure. I would like a national health system like they have in England. But it seems that we're not arguing about that anymore. We're arguing about other things that are much more rooted in the thousands-year human condition. Who's going to control everything, including the minds and hearts of people. So that's the best I can say about it. It's just how I sort of view the world. Yeah, Jerry.
You hear a lot the last few days about Ukrainian patriotism.
I'll repeat it. The question is about Ukrainian patriotism. Does it have the strength in the face of Russian aggression to keep up? And we do hear a lot about it. You know, I wonder about these nationalistic ideas, because when I hear the Ukrainian young people speak, and I did listen to a bunch of this today, I wasn't hearing so much Ukrainian pride as Ukrainians proud of being a democracy and look at how we made this great democracy. And it kind of reminded me of my own kids and others in their peer groups who are very proud to be Americans because of the promise of what they've been told it could deliver for a long time. Amanda Gorman, I don't know why she keeps popping into my head. This is a woman, I've never seen a more patriotic woman of her age. And what is she talking about? Amanda Gorman, the poet laureate, the young poet laureate who read at Biden's, she continues to write, and she writes a lot about this kind of thing. And what I see her saying, and my kids saying, and others like them, isn't, you know, that old chest beating kind of patriotism. It's more like a values-based patriotism, like we love Ukraine because we as Ukrainians did this thing. We got rid of Yushchenko, we put Putin out of our country, and so I don't know if it'll stand up to it or not. I don't know if it'll stand up to it here, because here we have two different kinds of patriotisms. And I don't know about you guys, I mean, I'm not the youngest person, well, I guess I am the youngest person in the room. I'm not the oldest person in the room, but yeah, we're looking around and I say, oh, Desiree's younger than me. But I'm a little on the younger side, kind of like early boomer, late boomer, early Xer. And I'll tell you that when I was growing up, those patriotic things, it felt like it was, you know, we're the true Americans versus the not, and it was very nationalistic and tribalistic. And now it seems that the younger people, this is just my impression, again, just from knowing my kids' friends and listening to these folks, that it's a little bit more values-based. Like they're not chest thumping, I'm a Ukrainian. It's more like, hey, look at what we did. We put this guy in office, and you know and so you're uniting around Ukrainianness as if it were uniting around small d Democrat. That's just my perception of it. I think that's a good trend. I mean, these are the kids that are not afraid to be who they are in terms of identity and, you know, orientation and all that stuff I write about and try to explain to you guys when you ask me these questions all the time. Because, you know, I think maybe because I'm your rabbi, but also because I'm on that edge where I've got these kids of that age. But I think they're talking about a different kind of freedom and liberty than we're hearing from the right wing, which is really more tribalistic and less open. You know, I have never heard a person in our congregation ever say anything negative ever about what right-wing Christians believe. Well, that's not true. I heard you say it, but with, you know, like hoping for, oh, it should be outlawed, right-wing Christianity, evangelical. We don't really care. When it comes down to it, we don't care what they believe. We just don't want them to make us believe those things. And that seems to be the big difference. Like, believe whatever crazy things you want to believe. I mean, of course, we prefer they didn't inflict it on the children, but they're going to have to fight out amongst themselves. Go ahead, Yelline.
One of my former students, her husband, lived in Ukraine, and she was supposed to...
Ukraine, only Ukraine, no the.
Yeah. Ukraine has its own history, Ukraine has its own culture, Ukraine has its own language, Ukraine has its own nation, Ukraine has its own territory, Ukraine is a sovereign country, Ukraine is not a part of Russia, it wasn't and will never be.
Okay, well, that's not historically accurate. I'm sorry, that's not historically accurate. Historically, it was the center of Russia. And but what I hear there, and you'll forgive me, I mean, I don't want to put words in their mouth, but what I hear there is we live in a place that's choosing a different direction. And that direction is, I'm going to use the geography, but you know what I mean, it's political, is the westward looking. It's Western civilization. That's what I see. Now, it is true that they also had their own dialect and their own culture and all that kind of stuff too. It's also true that Canada has a different culture and dialect than Michigan does. So I'm not taking that away, but I think that if Ukraine had not gone in this direction, we wouldn't be having this conflict. Because this conflict is not between Putin loving a certain way to say Russian and Ukraine loving a different way to say Russian, to speak in Russian. What the conflict is about is two completely different ways of organizing society. And the Ukrainians, I believe, and forgive me if I'm wrong, I know there's people watching online, and I could be completely full of it, but I feel that what they're really saying is, we've chosen a different route. We want to be part of freedom, and we want to be part of peace, and not part of aggression and bullying all the time. And Putin is a great bully. This is why Trump loves him so much. This is really, right? This is really our issue with the Republicans. We're not arguing over anything substantive anymore. Nobody's arguing over taxes anymore or any of that stuff. We're arguing over whether they get to boss us around all the damn time. And I think that's what Ukrainians are fighting about. They don't want to be bossed around. It's not their society. It's not their form of understanding the world. Melanie and then Nabil.
Yeah, they're just in a tough geographic spot.
They are.
Hungary going so right now, and Poland, and then Russia, and yeah, and so they are the yo-yo.
All those seam countries. Yeah, all those seam countries. Russia is no different today. No, but I think that's going to boomerang back, particularly in Hungary. Right? Poland's a little bit of a different story, but I think Hungary, it's not going to last forever. But this is a tale as old as time. The way that this, people seeking more say in things. Everybody knows that I have this very weird obsession with England. Okay, I get it. You're sick of me talking about it. But here's one of the reasons I love England, okay? Because the process by which they went from authoritarianism and autocracy to freedom and democracy, and they are a pretty good democracy today, was really organically interesting to me. It was, maybe if you were living in the middle of it at the time and you were what they call the leveler who wanted everybody to be equal and you were 300 years ahead of your time, maybe then it didn't feel that way. But when you see how it all got let go, slowly but surely, as opposed to France, which was like, boom, boom, there was constant, what's the word I'm looking for when you hurt your neck? Whiplash, constant whiplash, right? And even the purveyors of, democratic values were autocrats. The Tale of Two Cities is really a great metaphor for this. It's a tale of two worlds now. And that's okay, Nabil, yeah. They did, and then they regretted it, right? And then what happens is they like, okay, that didn't work. Let's do a reset. And then in the course of 28 years basically, they go from this horrible repeat, it was almost like a Soviet Union, right? Of Cromwellian disaster. And then they're like, okay, let's just do this slowly. And just over time, and glorious revolution. Nobody even knew they had a revolution. This is the only country in the world that ever had a revolution without having a revolution, as far as I know. And that's one of the reasons I'm obsessed with it, because it speaks to me of the need for people, or the reality, not need, of the reality that people are always looking back and forth, but sometimes there is just a smooth progression. I think we've had a pretty smooth progression in this country. I think the lurching that's going on right now is small. And that's why I have a lot of hope. I don't think our democracy is going away. But we do need to fix some things. Probably we won't be alive by the time those things get fixed, but I think they will get fixed. Some of the systemic things. Nabil, you wanted to say something.
I was just going to say, you mentioned about the kids, the generation, the way they look at what they're proud of being American, or, it's not just speaking, like you can often, running around the globe, I do see, I've been here for 44 years in the United States, and I remember when I first came here, I'm not saying it didn't happen, but I did not see I should tell you something, although I did not see the vice minister, not even close when I first came here. I remember, I always used to use the example of when I first went here, I used to date, American girls. I would go to the homes, open the door, and they were everywhere. I told people, all doors welcome, and then I was foreign. I got in the beat on the set, it was like I couldn't even speak English, right? And the parents are going there, welcoming. I can't imagine today with the name, having the same conversation with these people.
Well, yeah.
And then this whole thing, people walk around, if you don't go to the Taliban, you're not American. If you're not, if you don't have a big flag on your car or your house, you're not American. So.
Well, I'm going, so the issue is, are we more divided than ever? We are in some ways, but we also tend to forget the ways in which we were divided before. One of the reasons we're more divided now is because certain assumptions about being American have been called into question and are threatening people. Certain assumptions, particularly around race, but not only. That's a big part of it. But no one can tell me, who was a child in the 60s, and you guys who were young adults in the 60s, that we were not divided back then. I invite you to go watch a few episodes of All in the Family to be reminded that we were. The difference is that we had this boogeyman back then that kept us a little bit post-war united, called the Soviet Union. The Cold War was a big boon for a sheen of unity. We experienced it again after September 11th, but it didn't last. And that sheen of unity, it kind of blocked out some of the differences. And also, there were things that even people who were very progressive about accepting other people, that they had blinders to. They had blinders to some of the racism.
I do to a certain extent, like after 9/11, of course, I always think about this. It's like, what will unite us again today? Another 9/11? Because, we don't.
No, probably not. It didn't really unite us then. It didn't really unite us that well then.
I'm just glad I agree with you. It's like you say we had the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union on a daily basis was not infringing on lives. If you walk around the city and ask someone what the word is, we're studying in the Soviet Union.
The Soviet Union and anti-communism united this country to a very great degree.
But I mean, what I'm saying is I came here like 44 years ago. So the Soviet Union was there, obviously, in 1977. What I'm saying is if I walked and asked people to say, what keeps you up? I never heard the Soviet Union.
Oh, I heard it constantly. I'm sorry, that's all we thought about was nuclear war in the country from 1945 until 1991. That was all we thought about, was that. It dominated everything, Nabil. What did you guys do in school? The bomb shelters, the drills, we had a boogeyman out there that was so powerful that it could unite John F. Kennedy and McCarthy. There were unities that didn't even, but we don't have that now because it was so foreign and so weird.
General Kaufman said, I came here in 1977. You're going back to John Kennedy, 1960, I'm saying 77. I didn't go to school here.
Well, in the 80s, we were, well, okay, look, everybody has their own experience.
I'm not saying, I'm just saying, I came in 77, I didn't go to school here. I'm saying I did not see paranoia that was,
Well, I think the fact is that we do have a very authoritarian group in the United States right now, and it is dividing us because but those divisions were there before. And those of us who are in the non-authoritarian camp, we are less and less comfortable with that because we don't have common enemy anymore. The enemy is among us, but also we have more disinformation, we have a different kind of media, but I disagree. In the 80s, I mean, I remember being very scared, and this was towards the end of the Cold War, being very scared all the time about whether or not we were going to have a nuclear war. It seemed really likely to many people that we were going to wind up killing each other. Anyway, there were a couple of people in the back that had their hands up a really long time, Elaine and then Saul. Yeah.
And I went home, I had nightmares about Khrushchev in his shoe. And even for a young kid, it was terrifying. That was, and the whole thing was space, who was going to be first, and all of that. We were afraid because they were up there
Everything we did as Americans was competing with them, including up to and including going to the moon. That's all. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for presenting this today. Spectacular, very helpful. Can we talk a minute or two about we as a Jewish community can help Jewish people in the Ukraine? I know the Federation kind of put on.
Yeah, there's a lot of assistance. If you want to help specifically the Jewish community, well, honestly, you could go online. The Joint Distribution Agency, which is an arm of the Federation, does it. I know a lot of people don't like to give a Federation. A lot of people do like to give through Federation, but that's a very good one. The American Jewish World Service is a very, very good organization. There are plenty of others too. I would stay away from the one that's called the Jewish Confederation of Ukraine or something like that. I'm probably going to get in trouble for this. That's the one I think is a Chabad, basically, organization. But you can't go wrong, at least with this, with the Joint. I mean, I and my family worked with Joint for decades and decades. So, but I meant to put some links up, and I just it got away from me earlier. So I'll try. Maybe I'll send something out in the newsletter this week. Go ahead.
I'm just going to say that in the early 60s, when I was in the Air Force, our whole focus was on the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And then when the wall came down in Berlin, it's such a sense of disbelief.
Yeah.
That finally became reeling.
I had a 1-year-old, and in those days I prayed. You ever see, by the way, you know that little wooden stand we have out there? Some of you know this. That's my stender. That is where I put on my, that doesn't belong to the temple. That's on loan here. That's where I put on my tefillin and shekelled and davened. And I remember davening the day after the Soviet Union fell, thinking that was the end of all war now. There would just be nothing but peace. I mean, obviously the next day, I was cleared of that misconception. But my only point in bringing it up was to show that we did have this common boogeyman, and it was real. I mean, it was a real problem. But today I'll see, interesting, a lot of Democrats are, accusing these Republicans of being pro-Soviet, right? Because Putin was KGB. I don't think Putin was an economist, communist economist. I think he was what most of Russia really was, which was autocracy under the veil of this old Marxist egalitarianism that probably lasted about as long as a terrific movie, by the way, Red, lasted, and then was over after that. Because we know what happened to the real Soviet Union. It became an autocratic dystopian nightmare. At least, we could go to stores and buy things. Bruce.
I was just going to offer something to complement this. We're talking about an external source. But if you want to think internally, at least the sense that there was coherency or consistency in the belief in democracy was always working as long as those in power could control people of color, women, sexuality, and religion. And as that began to become decreased, and those forces rose up, then I believe the schism in terms of the integration of democracy began to fall apart, because those who could no longer control all the other classes no longer had democracy as a tool to control, and they began to look for a new tool.
Well, I see there's great wisdom in what you're saying, but I do think that there was a lot of, I think among the average Americans, like my parents, your parents, my grandparents, they really believed in the democracy of the United States. They didn't see these warts as being systemic. They saw them as being temporary and wanting to overcome them. I'll end with this. There was always this undercurrent of awareness in the United States that our democracy was not hitting all the was not hitting all the communities. And my awareness of this came about in a really bizarre place. I guess my wokeness, if you will, woke simply meaning, you know, I started to see things a little differently. You know, we all condemn, and rightly so, the Japanese internment camps. And we have this idea that everybody in America was just comfortable with that. That's just what had to be done. And then I saw a propaganda film about those camps and the amount of apologizing for them that was happening on the part of the narrator and the celebrity. And this fella managed to move out and go to Chicago, where he doesn't have to worry about being approached by Japanese infiltrators ever again. It was so weird to me. I would have thought that they would have either ignored it or not tried to put a spin on it or something. But here they were trying to explain how these white people who were running the country, they got it. All that told me was that there were people that were uncomfortable with it even then, and a lot of them. And I know it's like a really tiny example, but I know too that there were lots of people that were uncomfortable in the South, where I grew up in Miami, which was a southern city, with the kind of democracy we had there. So everything you're saying is true, but I also believe that democracy is very amenable to autocratic takeover. And that when we, and this is what we've been doing in the United States for quite some time now, when we start to try to push that aside, we're going to get a lot of pushback. We're going to get a lot of people who are going to exploit poor people and others and their own racism and the racism of their followers, and they're going to keep pushing back. My only thing that I want to say, I think we may be a little bit in the middle of that build-up to our glorious revolution. Our glorious revolution, where ultimately we are going to realize, and we're starting. Isn't that what all this wokeness is about? I mean, wokeness it's a silly argument about it, but all it really means is we're starting to see things from other people's point of view, from black people's point of view, and I think that's the reason 9/11 didn't work to keep us together, because we weren't willing to make Muslims into the bad guy as a society. Many of us did, but most of us, you know, the education was good enough and our own internal our own internal conscience was good enough that we began to realize that this was a much more diverse society and we couldn't look at it that way. I remember when the moment was for me, not that I was Islamophobic, but we all have different prejudices, is when I saw a woman in a hijab with a big rainbow button on the hijab. Yeah, I've seen it many times since then. Many times. Very proudly American Muslim, which is not the same kind of Muslim Islam that they came from, who have adopted these American values. To me, that's like a really good example that our glorious revolution may be happening. Doesn't mean it can't get squashed, but I still have hope. I still have a lot of hope that this democracy, that you're right, was a tool to keep people down, but it was also a tool to raise people up, because it's the best thing we got. We don't have anything else. All right, so we're going to conclude. I think that's enough of me pontificating on things that I only know a little bit about. Thanks. So, Arthur, what do we have? It's Frozen. What's the closing song?
Peace be with you.
Peace be with you. You all know that.